Hi, good evening. Welcome to right, top tip. Don't watch yourself on the YouTube feed, watch yourself on this because there's a slight lag on YouTube. Good evening, welcome to this evening's Beyond Belief podcast. It's great to have you with us tonight. Um, I'm really excited to be here. It's been a while since I've been live. Probably wondered where I've gone. I've also noticed that I've carefully queued up a live sort of placeholder on YouTube, and we're not on there, and it's broadcasting on a separate stream. I will aim to reunite those together later, and hopefully you'll be able to see, and it'll all work in the magic of technology down the line. Um, but if you are with us, welcome. It's great to be here tonight. Just a couple of things that I wanted to say before we get going today. Obviously, if you have been following the journey I've been on, or will follow the journey I've been on since the start of the year, I disappeared. We had a series of podcasts coming out over the first few months of the year following the Come Follow Me curriculum. For a couple of technical reasons and personal reasons, I needed to pause. I have a day job, as most of us do. I don't. I do this for love. I don't do it for money. And I have a day job, and my day job has been really, really intense since the spring. And I needed to just be able to step away slightly to be able to manage my day job. So that's what I've done, and that's why I've not been online. But I'm back with a vengeance. And one of the things that I've been doing while I've had this bit of a hiatus is just ponder the content that I'm creating and how that is useful to me in my journey, but also useful to people that are joining us on the podcast and joining us to watch what we're doing. I find the Come Follow Me curriculum exploring the church history fascinating. I really enjoyed doing those episodes that I've done. But I also have to concede that there are people out there that do it better. If you want to be able to understand church history, I would really, really endorse the work that's been done by Ganesh Cherian. He's been my guest on the podcast a couple of times. You'll find it particularly on TikTok. He's got a lot of short excerpts and videos which talk about every section of the Doctrine and Covenants. And I doff my cap to Ganesh. If you're watching this still, Ganesh, I totally respect the work you're doing. And I think that if people are looking at that history of the church, I think it's a fantastic resource. And so I'm going to turn around and say, if you want to follow that church history, look at Ganesh. And incidentally, he's just published a book about the history of Joseph Smith. I thought I'd plug it for him very quickly. I intend to buy it tomorrow because it's payday tomorrow. A very exciting book about Joseph Smith. What do I want to do? What's my purpose here then? Is really to explore and understand what that journey is for people as we look at the truthfulness of the church, the truth claims of the church, and what that looks like for us. So I've had a couple of episodes that are released with Sarah and with Robbie Bridgestock. If you've not had a chance to have a look at them, jump onto my YouTube channel, have a look. A couple of great stories of people who have left the church and talked about their stories and their experiences during that process. Some very powerful, interesting things there. If you've not looked already, go and have a look. And my intent is to perhaps explore a little bit more of that and look at those stories of people's faith journey. And perhaps I want to be a little bit more raw and look at my own experiences and what brings me to where I am in my journey today. Which brings me to the person that's sat very quietly on my screen to my right. I'm really, really excited to introduce. This is Lou, or Louisa. This is my daughter. And I am so proud to have Lou joining me today. Louisa, I'm going to shut up and get you to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Lou. I'm not sure what else to say.
Before we came live today, Louisa has been telling me that she's really nervous. I've tried to reassure her she doesn't need to be. If you are joining us in the chat, do please say hello. Do please jump in and share your hellos with us and your thoughts around what conversation we have today. Just to give a little bit of background. All right, I am a lifelong member of the church. I grew up in the church. My parents were and are. My father's an active member. My mother was throughout her life. Were active members of the church, and they brought me up. And if we want to play Book of Mormon, phrase. I knew I hadn't born a goodly parents. I had goodly parents who taught me and raised me well. And I grew up in the church. And obviously, when I grew up and I first had children myself, that continues to be the case, and it perpetuates it through the generations. So, in her early childhood, attended church. I'm sure she'll talk about she'll have vague memories of attending primary and singing funny primary songs and those kind of things. Here, you can see she's nodding as we're talking as she's recollecting on that. For various reasons, Lou's mother and I separated when she was 7 years old, and that's not a story for this podcast. I won't go into the details of that. The relevance of that is that when her mother and I separated, Louisa's mum stopped attending church, and I very quickly went less active as well. I was less active for a period of about 7 years. So for Louisa, the early first 7 years of her life were that intense pre-raptors and primary, and then the church was peripheral around. Is this fair to say? Correct me if I'm wrong, Louisa. I'm telling your story, not rather than letting you. Um, but the church was very peripheral around your life. It was always there. You were close to your grandparents who obviously talked about church. Um, you attended church a little bit from time to time. When I went back to church, you had to come with me. When you were with me at weekends, so the church was kind of peripheral in your life, without a full explanation of what it was all about. Is probably fair.
I mean, yeah, as much as my very early childhood, with you and mum, we were at church all the time. It was a huge, huge part of our lives. When you and mum stopped going, there was actually it felt like a long time. I was quite small, so it probably wasn't that long, but I would still continue to go. I used to travel with Grandad a lot. Um, to the woods around the area, and I was baptised after you guys were not attending. And then I stopped attending as I got a little bit older, so probably when I was about 9. But then obviously went back to Young Women's when you started becoming more active again, when I was probably about 12. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So
And so there was a few years there where I was in it, but not really in it. It was a very confusing time.
I can't apologise for that, and that's not even a case of oh, it's church and we're not anymore. It would have been very difficult, and at the time, I felt I was doing the right thing, and possibly wasn't. You know, but I was trying to do the best I could, and it would have given a very mixed kind of life of what is and what isn't, and not fully understanding some of the things that we thought of why, and those kind of things there. Um, Louisa and I, as I've gone through this disconstruction process, Louisa keeps asking me questions. Why do you do this? Why do members of the church do that? Why did you believe that? Um, So the purpose of what we want to do today, and today really this what we're hoping will work and will be the start of a series of these, is a question. It's kind of like a question and answer, giving Louisa the opportunity to answer or to ask rather the questions that she has. Why did members of the church do this? Why did I, as your dad, believe the things that I did? How did that impact on my life? And hopefully, it helps Louisa yourself make sense of some of the things that I did and believed along the way, and helps at the same time help us explore some of the cognitive dissonance that exists within the church, some of the doctrines and things the church does, and why the church does the things the way it does, explore those beliefs. Um, that's me waffling for apparently been going 10 minutes, Louisa. And I've been waffling like mad. That's how I interpret what we want to do today. What are your thoughts? What
I
are your
mean, I think it's going to be interesting to ask the questions. Because I mean, I feel like I ask them all the time anyway. But also, because there was a period of time where I was really involved in the church, and I was so young, like I don't know, I don't think your brain's formed enough to really understand what's going on. So there was a period of time where I was really involved in the church as a child, and then you had like that preteen years where there was a huge step back in my life, and I think that is the sort of age where you start to form form your own thoughts and opinions and questions, and then going back to church for young women's, it often left me sat there thinking, I don't get it. And I think it's just a good opportunity to ask the questions and find some answers. But also, I still don't get it sometimes. And I don't know, I just think if I can't be the only person that doesn't get it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that is why I think that for other people who are looking at their faith, whether they are people from outside looking at the church and what the church does, whether it's members of the church who are trying to make sense of some of the doctrine and things that the church believes, or whether it's people who perhaps are questioning or stepping away from the church slightly, I'm hoping that the conversations that we have will help people with that deconstruction or construction of their faith along the way. I want to be clear, okay, for the audience, not clear with you, Louise. I know you know we've talked about this a lot. I want to be clear with the audience. My aim is never to tear down people's faith and to drive people away from the church. All right. My strong belief is for those people who watch more on stories, follow John Delim, for instance, we talk about the idea of informed consent. Okay, is that if you are going to be involved with something, and particularly as something as demanding as membership in the church of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that you're doing that fully understanding the full context of what's discussed. Um, I believe that there are aspects of the church that are played down, are hidden, are denied, are covered up, are um, gaslit, to be honest, in some places. And I think to understand full disclosure about where the church is, what the church's doctrines are and were, is really important and can be very eye-opening at times. All right, and but my conversation today is to explore those areas and join us in the chat. If you've got thoughts about things we're talking about, tell us. If you've got opinions, let us know. I'm really interested to know what your opinions and thoughts and feelings are, and that's as an audience. Um, if understanding the complexities of the church and its history build your faith, brilliant. I want to know all about it. I want to know why. If they do cause questions, talk about it and get in touch and talk to us. I'm really excited to share these conversations with not just with you, Lou, but with an audience, with people who feel they might need it. Before we get into you grilling me, is there anything you want to add? I feel like I said before we went on air, that I talk too much. All right, feel free to cut me off at any time. Is there
No, it's
anything
okay.
you want to bring in or talk about before we get going?
I want to make it really clear that my understanding of the church is limited, and that is the point. It's that it stops at almost like a primary level of understanding, but that is kind of half the point of my questions. That is where my learning stopped. That's where I stopped being involved as much, and I think that is why I have so many questions. But I don't want anyone to think that I'm trying to talk on something that I know nothing about because I'm not. It's a question. It's not because I have any knowledge. Yeah.
And that's the point. Is allegedly I have the knowledge, and you're using me as the resource to get the knowledge from.
Yeah, and I
Okay.
mean, if anybody in the comments is going to chip in with like a different perspective, that's actually fantastic because the more points of view, the more answer to the question, I suppose. Because you in yourself can only be one lived experience. Everybody
Yeah.
has a different experience, and that's what I'm curious about.
And I think that comment there is actually really important. This is about lived experience.
Mhm.
I sit in an online world. I see a lot of conversations go on, particularly on X or Twitter, depending on how you know these things. And I see some real battles going on between members of the church who feel like they need to come onto that forum and defend the faith. And some of them are quite obnoxious and don't represent the church in my opinion, but they're quite obnoxious and aggressive about how they do that. And then you do get some, frankly, people in the ex-Mormon space who are quite obnoxious and aggressive back in the other direction as well. And there's a bit of a fight going on, and a point scoring. It's like, it's not what it's all. Yeah, we all have
See,
lived experiences. If the church works for you, fantastic.
See, in contrast, I have virtually no social media,
Yeah.
and my experiences being a kid at a ward where everybody is absolutely lovely and we're just not understanding as I've got older.
Well, you say a world where everyone was lovely. Obviously, in your earliest childhood, we were down south in Hampshire. Um,
Yes.
and then later on, we were in a very, very, very small branch. I don't know if you appreciate that because of your age and those kind of things there. Um, Before we stopped going to church at that point, um, we were members of a branch in a small town in the Midlands in England. We had an active membership, and for those who understand how these dynamics were, active membership of about 25. We had a branch president who was elderly, unwell, was semi-active as a result, and not through his faith and his belief, but through his health. And we had this really small branch, and it was challenging. It was hard work, and everyone who was active in that branch worked really, really hard to try and keep it going. Um, so yeah, you had a couple of different experiences along the way. But I'm sure as we talk and as we explore over the coming weeks, we'll get into all of that, and these things will come through. Let's throw this across to you, though, Lisa, because obviously the whole point of this is to ask questions. For today, what do you want to know?
Okay, so my question of the day is why don't people ask? That's sort of broad. Um, what I mean by that is I feel like there's a lot of questions that sit under the surface, and maybe I'm just too forward and I go straight in for the kill with a question. But I feel like sometimes you ask a question, and if it's got a tricky answer, it's sometimes sidestepped.
Can you give me an example of of something like that? And it doesn't mean I go ask today because I want to focus on the what you've asked. But have you got a question that would be an example of that?
I just feel like sometimes the things that the church teaches, or at least my understanding of it, it doesn't make sense. And I don't understand why no one asks because it doesn't make sense to me. And
Yeah,
that's okay that maybe I don't have enough knowledge. Maybe my knowledge is a gap and that's why I don't understand.
yeah,
But some things just don't make sense. And I feel like if you reframed it in a position of like if Joseph Smith was alive today and was building the church today, I just feel like maybe there would be a different attitude. Like this is
yeah,
an established faith. Like I don't know the especially listening to the podcast that you were doing before.
yep,
The seer stone in the hat thing. I had no idea. I had seen the pictures and the paintings, the plates, getting translated, and it blew my mind. I was like, does no one think, oh gosh, that's odd. If someone did that today, no one would be like, oh yeah, sure. Um, or maybe they would. I don't know. But this is where I'm asking: is it a gap in my knowledge, or do people not ask?
so let me come back with a question on that. And it's interesting that you mentioned what's supposed to be known as the rock in the hat. Okay, yeah, and we're talking about the Joseph Smith translating the gold plates from the Book of Mormon. Okay, what's interesting is when you talk about why don't people ask, is you're not pushing back and saying why don't people not query the fact that Joseph really get gold plates and translate them and see an angel and translate them and produce this book of scripture. Your question is why are you worried about the rock in the hat?
Yeah,
Does but so all of a sudden, gold plates and angelic visitations, professing to be God the Father and the Son, saying that they're going to restore God's gospel. All right, through Joseph Smith, an angel visiting him, giving him the gold plates, him taking these gold plates and translating them, although nobody's seen them. That's not the question. The question is when there's a rock and a hat,
They just
why is
start
no one
laughing.
questioning it? Now, can you see what I mean? Yeah,
Yeah,
okay. Is that you're presenting one piece that is a bit strange, but
yeah,
ignoring all the rest of it, ignoring all the rest of it, which outside of an LDS thinking is bizarre or comes across very,
yeah.
very bizarre. Yeah.
I can, thing is, I can
So
accept. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to cut you off, but I
yeah,
can accept the fact that I can accept the fact that there was a vision.
yeah,
Um, I don't actually like. I don't know. Maybe I'm too evidence based for the line of thinking, but I can accept. I don't need evidence for a vision. No one can prove that. That is just something that has been reported has happened. I don't really understand why no one's ever seen the plates. That's odd to me. That feels like something that I personally would find like evidence
yeah.
is needed. But I understand that some people don't need that either. But just a rock and a hat, he's like looking at them.
Yeah, okay. So the reason I push back on that isn't because I want to get into rock and hat. I think it'd be another episode that we could do to have a really great
Yeah.
conversation about rock and hat. But it's actually a great case example of what we're talking about. Why do people not question?
Hmm.
Okay, and you grew up in those first formative 7 years of your life being told the story of Joseph Smith. Yeah, it's not a story that you've not heard before. Yeah,
Mhm.
and therefore, when I present that story to you, it's something that has familiarity to your childhood,
Yeah.
and you're like, oh, yeah, all right. But the rocking hat is that's a bit odd, isn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
It really took
Okay.
me aback when I heard it.
What's interesting to try and answer the question properly then. Okay. In terms of my thought of thinking, now I can only really think from my point of view. I cannot speak for every ex-member of the church. I can only really talk about my experiences and perhaps look at some of the psychology a little bit and look at a little bit around why people do and things, the messages that are given across. I, um, we at the moment here are currently Bible study with JWs. All right, we've got this lovely JW couple with who I absolutely adore. I've no interest in becoming a JW, but I am very interested in understanding what they believe and why.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we Bible study with them, and we've had some really, really great conversations. But most of what they're saying is outside my frame of normal reference. Yeah. So I question everything. Yeah. We've had some really great conversations because they allow credit to them if other JWs, when they're out Bible studying with people, accept the level of questioning that I have put across to the two that we know, then
Hmm.
I doff my cap to them actually because we're not rude, but we push back and we
Yeah.
ask and we challenge. All right. And they are willing for that and have those conversations with us. It's been a really excellent experience. But because it's not my frame of reference, yeah, and it's all new to me, I question everything they're saying. On the other hand, when I look at my experience growing up in the church, okay, my earliest childhood memories are my parents taking me to church.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have pictures of us being in my head, not actual pictures. I've got mental pictures of me being in the chapel on the Isle of Wight. Um, we left the Isle of Wight when I was under five. I have mental pictures
Yeah.
of that chapel and being in primary there and singing songs about Joseph Smith, singing songs about Jesus, being taught who Joseph Smith was, talking about the call and mission, and the gospel, the core doctrines of the church, if you like, were taught to me as far back as I can remember. And when that is the case, they're familiar to you. And they're taught to me by people I trust. Yeah, we all trust our parents, or most of us trust our parents. And as children, When our parents tell us something is true, it is. All right. You know full well, all right, that between me and your uncle, we know the answer to everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. All
Oh yeah.
right.
Oh yeah. I
All right.
completely
And
understand.
in the
Yeah.
same way is my dad would always turn to me and say, with any question, that he would always claim that him and his brother, my uncle, knew everything. And I believed that. Yeah. Um, and my dad is a very wise man. He does know an
Mhm.
awful lot. You know, he's a good man. He's a wise man. And as a child, if he or my mum told us something was true, then it was.
Yeah.
And we build those relationships with people that we trust over time. I remember when I was teaching in Derby at the training centre we had there, and I had a student in that class who, one of the things that I love, particularly when you have a class full time and you're teaching, that's as in my professional life, people are listening in, I teach digital IT and cybersecurity for apprentices. And we used to do a course full time, 5 days a week. And I had this one lass in my class who, because I was the trainer, trusted everything I said. And I actually had to be really careful because if I was inaccurate, she would believe what I would say. Shamefully, one day I decided to have a little bit of sport with this. Okay.
Mhm.
And she had a nice woolen jumper. It was Angora wool jumper. And I picked
Right.
up with this and I said to her, "You know, wool doesn't come from sheep, don't you?" And she looked at me and said, "Don't be silly. Of course it does." And I said, "No, no, it doesn't. Um, Wool comes from rabbits." And she's like, "No, it doesn't. It comes from sheep." I said, "No, it comes from rabbits." And I then went and found a Wikipedia article about Angora rabbits, and actually, on a technicality, Angora wool does come from Angora rabbits. It's the only wool that does. Yeah,
Yeah.
and told her that it was a common myth that wool came from rabbits, that came from sheep, and it actually comes from rabbits. And she went home that night, apparently, and had a row with her mum because her trainer wouldn't lie to her. Okay. All right. Because there was that level of trust.
Oh.
When you grow up within a faith tradition,
Yeah.
you trust the people that teach you.
Yes.
Yeah. You trust the things that are said to you and you don't question them. All right. Um, and certainly for me, I didn't question them. It was what was taught, and therefore it was true. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that was the case whether we're talking um, the, the church, how the church worked, or whatever it might be. The other side of it as well is the way the church demonstrates truthfulness.
Yeah.
Okay, um, the burden of proof of the church is very much based around emotion. Uh, when the missionaries teach, what they will do is they will teach concepts of the gospel. They will direct people to a scripture in the Book of Mormon in Moroni, which encourages people to pray. And there's what's known as Moroni's promise, where the promise is there that if you will go and pray about these things, God will tell you in your heart that these things are true.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the church is looking for, encouraging you to go and get a what we call a spiritual witness of truth. And
Okay.
when the missionaries see that positive emotion, they will then and they do this because that's what they're taught is there. They're not being cynical and manipulative. The missionary is not, okay. But they will see the person they're teaching emotional, have positive feelings. They'll jump on that and say, "That's the Holy Ghost." and then they will encourage that emotion. And you study psychology at university, you
Yeah.
understand the power of emotion
Hmm.
in what becomes true.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me give you a slightly off the wall example if I can share this with you a second. Yeah. Now, outside of my day to day life and this kind of thing, what's one of my favorite passions? What do I love doing? What we've been talking about earlier that I'm looking forward to doing at the end of the summer?
Football.
Okay. I've only ever taken you to a football match once. I want you to imagine you're stood in a crowd.
Okay.
Keep hoping the sound's coming through.
Yeah, it's fine.
I think that's probably enough of that clip. It's not all about playing that wonderful music. Okay. When you're
Yeah.
all right, when you're stood in that crowd, there is heightened emotion.
Oh yeah, it's contagious.
All right. It is contagious, it becomes important to you, and people become very dedicated to their football teams. And one of the side effects of dedication to football teams can be this. All right. It's the same group of fans who I would suggest the majority of them are not bad people.
Hmm.
And what we're seeing in that clip is crowd trouble just before a Southampton Portsmouth match.
Oh.
Okay. All right. And we see, well, and my point is this: it's that heightened emotion will bring people to a point where they are so dedicated to something, normal behavior and reason can go out the window. And I think for me, not that I ever would have got involved in crowd trouble, and certainly not crowd trouble at church. All
Yeah.
right, that heightened emotion for me means that the emotional feelings around why the church is true take precedence. And when something challenges that,
Yeah.
you fight back against it.
But with the same question though, when something's challenging your standpoint, what, why, why don't we ask?
So, so first of all, we need to know there's something to ask.
Yeah.
Okay, we need to. So if we come back to the idea of the rock and the hat, which you gave me a minute ago, right? The official church narrative on how the Book of Mormon was translated um, is that Joseph had the plates. He had them out on the table in front of them. He had like a barrier, sort of like almost like a tea towel or something, I guess, in the middle of the room with Oliver Cowdery on the other side of the room. And he wore something called Urim and Thummim, which were like spe- spectacles. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he read from the plates, read what was there, and Oliver wrote down, but couldn't see the plates because he was on the other side of a partition. Okay. That's been the way that the church has taught that narrative for 150 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Now there are questions about why. That's another discussion as to why was that the narrative, and it's only recently with the advent of the internet that this alternative interpretation of it, of the rock and hat, if you like, that has come to the fore. In fact, one of the first places that communicated this alternative um, method of translating was on that great documentary program called South Park.
Right. Okay.
All right, South Park. The writer of South Park, they did an episode where Kyle met a family of Mormons and wanted to become a Mormon, and he asked what it was all about. And there's this very spoofy South Parky rendition of how Joseph got the plates and how he translated the Book of Mormon, which indeed follows the Rock and the Hat narrative. And I know when that came out, I looked at it and said, "That's not true."
Right. Okay.
All right. And most
Hmm.
members would say it's not true. And the church has kind of not really, they've distanced themselves from that story.
Yeah.
You know? So it's not, so most members don't know or didn't know the Rock and Hat story. And it's only in recent times that we have South Park, we have various church initiatives. We have something called the Joseph Smith Papers Project, where the church has gone to all the Joseph Smith Papers and documents and records and evidences and have published those for people to be able to see. That
Right.
all of a sudden we're seeing this Rock and Hat narrative is true. Yeah. Now, if you want to be really pedantic, I can actually, because I've looked, find a couple of examples, and I mean a couple of examples where a church leader has described translation using the Rock and Hat narrative as opposed to what's normally there, but they are very
Mhm.
few and far between. They're glossed over. Every chapel has pictures of Joseph Smith translating plates the way that I was brought up doing those kind of things there. But most members aren't really aware of the alternative narrative that's there.
Okay.
Um, and if you don't know, how do you question?
I mean, I guess I do understand that. I do understand that to a degree,
Yep,
but I feel like we've got focused on the rock and the hat thing. I think it extends to all sorts of things.
yeah,
Like I don't understand some of the rules. I don't get the rules about coffee. Why do we hate on coffee so much? Coffee is great.
I agree. I agree. Um, I think in terms of specific rules, if you like, I think those need to be conversations about those there. But
Yeah.
play with the rock and hacks. It's the example that you,
Hmm.
but the same
Yeah.
principle lies true. If we look at the same principle, whether we're talking about the church, the official narrative around polygamy is very,
Yeah.
and the church has a very sanitized version of that, and it's communicated in a very different way. Go and ask members of the church how many wives Joseph Smith had, and most of them won't know.
I
They'll look
completely
at he
understand that.
had, yeah, all right, and so on. These things are there. What the church does, I believe, is try very hard to control the narrative.
Yeah. I, you can see some evidence of that, sure. I
Yeah,
think I think what I mean as well, it's not just why do people ask, but why do people challenge what they're told when like conflicting questions or facts come to light, or things maybe that make you question about yourself. If that makes sense.
so give me an example.
So I don't know if you've ever experienced a moment like this. I'm sure that you have. But has there ever been a moment where there's something that just feels kind of wrong? Um, so the church believes something, and from your own morals, it doesn't necessarily agree. And how often are people saying, well, why is it like I I know we didn't want to like touch too much on it today, but like for example, um, problems with same-sex relationships. Okay, do you personally have a problem with that, or is it not okay because the church says so? And depending on where you sit on an answer to that question, I suppose would depend on the response that you have.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and on that, I can only really answer for me. All right,
Yeah.
because every person's experience around that is different. You
Mhm.
know, for me, I have never, ever, 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 ever understood why there is an issue with same-sex relationships. that I can I've never been able to understand if someone is gay and is with someone of the same gender, why that's an issue. All right.
Hmm.
I've never cared. Or at least I have cared because I'm an ally. Yeah, I cared in terms of fairness. To say I don't care is
Yeah.
actually a little bit untrue. Yeah. But it's never been something that has, on a personal level, I've ever thought is wrong. It's because it isn't. All right. Um, and it's as simple as that. It's like I was saying to you the other night. Is I remember sitting at university in the student union with a friend of mine who was um, bisexual, who was female, I got the girls together. Now, like I've said at the time, I think there's issues with that different on a different level, but
Yeah.
it's not that you know I've never had a problem with that. I've had friends over the years who are, and isn't that the classic? Those I don't have a problem with people who are gay. I've got friends that are gay, you know,
Mhm.
um, but I have had friends that just are friends, you know, that it's not been. But the problem is this: is let's go back to the football scenario for a moment, and that heightened emotion and that belief with everything you've been grown up with that the church is true. Okay,
Yeah.
and that isn't something that we question. Yeah, the you have that spiritual experience that gives you testimony. Yeah, as the church would describe it, and that is a confirmation that overrides and says the church is true. Yeah,
Okay.
coupled with the fact that I have grown up my entire life being taught the doctrines of the church from the people I trust most,
Hmm.
and that the church is true.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've got those two, um, what's the one, those two strands pushing together. Yeah, and so the prevailing thing is the church is true. So I now have the church is true and says one thing,
Hmm.
and my personal morals and values say something else. Yeah, all
Okay.
right. Um, and that gives you a real cognitive dissonance. Yeah, it gives a real challenge in terms of how you stand with the two issues, because the church is true. You're not questioning that.
I think I've just been left alone. Or, oh, panic. I was just in my mind to see if I can back in.
Okay.
Are we back?
Yeah, I'm back. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I think.
Hi, just for the purpose of the audience, having a fantastic internet connection is massively helpful. As we were talking, my internet connection dropped, but we are back sounding great now, I believe. So fingers crossed we are there. In my panic to get back online, I lost my train of thought. What were the last things we were talking about?
We were talking about how the belief from your emotions and then being told it your entire life comes together.
Yeah. And so you end up with this. I believe the church is true because it's true. Yeah.
Hmm.
All right. And I don't believe this is wrong because it's not.
and you actually have this real dilemma, or for me, this real dilemma between the two, trying to square that circle. And I always found it really, really hard. Okay, because I have never, like I said, never ever ever seen or perceived or felt there is a problem with being gay. Yeah, being in a same-sex relationship. I don't understand why it'd be a problem. Theologically, if we want to get into theological discussion, I could probably explain why the church roughly takes the stance it does. Don't agree, and I think that there are things that can be looked at there that it's not as cut and dry as you think. All right,
Hmm.
but I've never ever seen it as a problem myself. But you can't pick and choose with with the gospel. Yeah, it is what it is. These doctrines are taught by prophets old, prophets modern, and we trust on the prophet, and we follow their words, and we do that, and we do what's there. So I would have given you a very wishy-washy answer to this question. All right.
Okay.
And it was the wishy-washy answer is because it's the only way I could square it myself, because it my answer's probably not going to make sense, but I wouldn't say it really made sense to me. Yeah.
Okay.
In that I would turn around and say something along the lines of, I personally do not have a problem with it, but I understand what the church's position is, and I respect, and I'm not going to argue with that, or something like that. Okay.
Right. Okay.
As I sit where I am now, looking back, I potentially think that is a worse response than actually turning around and saying,
Yeah. Sorry.
the
It
church,
is.
yeah, no, it is, it is. But I said I'd be open and honest with you. I look back now and think trying to hold that double position is potentially more offensive than just saying, oh, I think you're wrong. You shouldn't be gay. I
Yeah.
think it's worse. All right, but that's how I would have squared it, and that's because I my personal belief was that, and personal values was there wasn't something wrong with it being gay.
Yeah.
Like using that phrase, it makes it sound like there's something to be. I can't think of a better way of putting it, though. Do you know what I mean?
Face to face.
Um, but having to hold the church's position where I am now, I can just say what I think.
Yeah.
All right. And I don't know. I'd have to have a survey of a load of members of the church in front of me and ask them. But I suspect many members of the church have their own distances on different issues, whether it be the LGBT discussion, whether it's something else, have their own distances, or the area where they say, don't agree personally,
Mm.
but I'm going to accept that it's the case.
Okay.
Um, and then a lot of the ex-Mormon community talks about the idea of putting stuff on your shelf. And what you do is you concede that you don't understand why, that God knows all, He'll answer it one day in the eternities. And so you put it on your shelf and you put it to one side, um, and move past it. And that's fine until one day your shelf breaks because there's so many things on it that just don't make sense anymore that you that you have to address some of these things.
So, so correct me if I'm picking up the wrong thing. So, but people don't ask because people don't ask or challenge the things that don't make sense to them because it causes too much internal conflict, and so it gets popped on the shelf because people can't deal with it. Is that right? Would that be kind of accurate to say?
Like I said, I can only speak for me. All
Hmm.
right, and I have spoken to other people who've stepped away from the church who might echo a similar thing on various areas there. But I wouldn't want to suggest that what I'm saying there is authoritative.
Hmm.
Yeah, but I would say that it echoes my experience. All right,
Okay.
because the thing is the church discourages that.
But I
Okay,
feel like that in itself raises a question.
go on. Yeah.
Like, if you are discouraging questions and discouraging doubt, I think doubt's healthy, and I think it's how to learn. You can't. If no one ever questions anything, we'd never get anywhere. I think it makes sense that you should be questioning, because ultimately, if you question something and still come to the same answer, and that results in the church being true, does that not further solidify your faith and everything that they teach?
So, so I'm going to use a word here that I don't normally use when I'm talking about the church. Okay, and that is because there is a guy called Stephen Hassan, who I've heard interviewed a couple of times, and he is a specialist in cults. All
Okay.
right, all right, and he has something called the bite model. And the idea is the bite model is a way to be able to assess whether something might be a cult. And I can't remember what the bite model stands for. I've not come prepped up to discuss the bite model today. But one of the I in bite model is information.
Hmm.
Yeah, and one of the suggestions is that one of the ways that you can recognize a cult is based around information being controlled.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, Now, I that's the last time I'm going to use the C word here. All
Okay.
right. I think it's hard to actually accuse an organization of being a cult. It's quite a strong accusation. It's inflammatory to many, it's offensive to many, and those kind of things there. It is certainly, it's a phrase that I've picked up as I've been deconstructing, is I would describe the church as what I call a high demand religion.
Okay.
Okay. But what's important when I discuss the Bible model is this information piece. And the church is very, very careful to curate and look after its image. And there are a few quotes that go with this. So, for instance, if you go back to the Ensign, now I don't know if you remember or know what the Ensign is. The Ensign was a magazine. The church has a monthly magazine that it publishes to its membership, and they did one for adults, and there was one for youth, and one for kids. Yeah, the kids is the one is the Friend. I suspect you'll remember the Friend magazine.
Oh yeah, I had loads of those.
Yeah, okay. These days, the ensign has changed. It's no longer called the ensign, it's called Leahona. But the ensign, if you go back to June 2001, there is an article in there which has a particular quote that is referenced in quite a lot of places. But this is one place I can find the quote. And it's the idea that it says, when the prophet speaks, the debate is over. Okay. As a comment there. So if the idea being, if the prophet says something is true, is the case, you don't need to question it anymore. Okay.
Right. Okay.
All right. Elder Oakes, who is currently the first counselor in the first presidency, so he's the second most senior person in the church. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Who will imminently become the prophet, the president of the church. President Nelson, I don't know if you're aware, who's the current prophet, is 100. He's approaching 101 years old. He
Oh
is
no
very,
way.
very elderly. And with the best man of the world, I would be surprised if we don't have President Oakes as president of the church within this year, just because of the age of Russell Nelson. Okay.
Okay.
In an interview in 2007, he said, "It is wrong to criticize the leaders of the church, even if the criticism is true." All right.
Ah. Right. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm.
Boy K. Packer, he was an apostle. So he was one of the quorum of the 12 that sit underneath the first presidency. He's passed away a few years ago, but 1981, in a talk, he said, "Some things that are true are not very useful."
Right. Okay.
Okay. All right. President Uchtdorf, who's one of my favorites,
Okay.
okay, he's a good guy. He's a German guy. He's a German apostle. He's actually really one of the. If you're listening to the apostles, he's one of my favorites. His messaging is good. I think that he comes across well morally. I like him. Okay, but
Okay.
in 2013, he gave a talk which is entitled "Doubt Your Doubts Before You Doubt Your Faith," and he talked about the idea of, if you're having doubts, to doubt those doubts.
What? To
Okay.
doubt your
And
doubt.
doubt your doubts. Okay. Um, what I'm trying to show here is a theme that comes through, and that is that the church encourages you to stay on the boat, if you like. Yeah. We assume that the church is led by people who are inspired by God, that are prophets, that speak to God. Yeah. And they are telling us what God wants us to know. And so if they tell us something is the case, then the assumption is they're correct. Yeah. If you are doubting or got questions or queries, people will encourage you to go back to that spiritual witness. Yeah. Because that spiritual witness that says the church is true, that really strong emotional piece is the anchor point. And if you can, then the idea is if you can rediscover that spiritual witness and remind yourself of the truthfulness of what's there, that will carry you through. So the church really, really actively encourages people to doubt your doubts. In terms of looking at information, we're taught only to seek information from church approved sources. Yeah. So if
That's something I cannot understand.
and they're quite blatant. If someone is producing content that is outside of church-approved sources, it will very get labelled with the moniker of anti-Mormon literature. Yeah, and will be full of lies.
If it
And
can be
that's the
fact
way
checked to be
these.
true, though, then it's just not a lie.
The
I'm sorry, I'm
but when the
confused.
when yeah when the source organization who you implicitly trust says it's lies, you assume that's the case. It's a bit like, in my opinion, is a bit like a certain president of the United States who may look like a tangerine, turning around and calling everything that doesn't agree with him fake news.
I mean, all right, there. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and that's quite a
Okay, yeah.
strong way of putting it. That's quite a strong way of putting it. And I apologise to someone who is a member of the church who's listening to this thing. That's a little bit extreme, but it's not. It is a case of that's not sanctioned, correlated, and produced by the church. It's produced by something else. It's designed to detract, and it is um, anti-Mormon. It's lies, and you will find. And many times I've had conversations with people who, and not through this current faith journey, but over time, if you refer to something that isn't church approved, well, its authenticity, its veracity is brought into question very quickly. The church did actually produce a series of what are called gospel topics essays. All
Okay.
right. And the gospel topics essays are quite interesting. They produced a load of essays that were designed to answer some of the big questions the church has. They are actually on the church's website. Rocking a hat's on there. Okay.
Okay.
Amongst other things that are there, trying to answer them with a faithful spin. They've never made a big song or dance there. The accusation the ex-Mormon community often makes is they're there, but they don't tell anyone about them, and no one really knows that they're there. I'm not sure whether that's true or not, to be fair. I was aware of them. I'd not really read them, all right,
Mhm.
but I was aware of them. So is it fair to say the church has put these out there and nobody knows that they're there? I don't know whether that's true. I do know plenty of people who will turn around and say, nobody told me they were, I didn't know, and therefore I didn't use them as a resource. And I
Mhm.
do know plenty of people that when they go and look at the gospel topics essays, they've become that doubting, questioning piece that's caused challenges in their faith. All right.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Um, how much hidden were they when they came out? I vaguely remember them being announced. I had a brief look at them, didn't spend a lot of time reading them. I think, personal opinion, I think the fact that they exist allows you to know that they're there with the answers without ever reading them. I think for me, I knew they were there and I knew they contained the answers, so that was enough, and that I could go to them if I needed to, and therefore I didn't bother because I was busy with day-to-day life.
Yeah.
I think for me that was more. Now I can't speak for other people. All right,
Mhm.
were they hidden? Were they carefully released in such a way that people didn't know about them? I don't know. I don't. know that that's true. It is sometimes the accusation that is made or the feelings that's there. Certainly, I don't think that every member knows they exist, and I think and people come back and say, "Oh, I wasn't told about those." They would just, I don't know whether that's true or not. I wouldn't want to cast an aspersion in a direction. Really wouldn't. Like I said, I knew about them. I just didn't read them because I didn't feel I needed to, and I suspect that that is quite common as well.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I get that.
What are your thoughts? Have I answered the questions you have, or have I gone off in the wrong directions?
No, I think it has answered some of them. I mean, in some ways, though, I think it sparked more.
Yeah, good.
Um, I just like saying that we should trust the teachings of the prophet, or what the prophet says is, the end of the argument, all that kind of thing. What about when they flip flop? Like, what about when they change their mind and we go backwards? And my understanding is that the church is supposed to be a restoration of like an original faith. Okay, sorry, that was a really bad way to explain that, but that's my understanding. Is it's supposed to be a restoration, so it's supposed to be like replicating what it was originally. That is my understanding of the whole point.
Yeah.
So why are we changing the rules if the point is that it is exactly the same and we're going back to the way it should be? And well, I don't know that God is going to bring out new revelation and change his mind just because the world's changed. That doesn't make sense to me.
If the church hadn't changed its rules in the 150, 200 years that it existed, the church wouldn't be here today.
No, of course it wouldn't.
All
But
right.
that is my point.
Okay. To give you a couple of examples of that, the church pulled back from polygamy being officially what we do
Hmm.
because the United States were busy arresting all the leaders, putting them in prison, seizing churches' assets. It would have closed the church down, and it preserved. But by pulling away from polygamy as an act being actively practiced, stopped the church being destroyed.
I wasn't even on
Um,
about anything that was quite
yeah,
that, like big. That is big. You can kind of understand why they'd say, okay, we can still believe this, but we're not going to practice it. I mean something as like, as basically the garment thing that's going on at the moment. Apparently, there's been new garments brought out. That blew my mind. It blew my mind because I don't understand. I don't understand. I still feel weird if my knees are out, and I'm a grown woman now. I've not been to church since I was like 12.
why do you cover? You're a grown woman. You've never been to the
Mhm.
temple. Why do you feel like you need to cover your knees?
Just because it was drilled into me. It was immodest.
Interesting, isn't
It,
it? Yeah,
I don't,
that's my
I
fault.
don't believe it. I don't believe it. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. But I will still like check myself before I go outside. I'm like, oh, a bit short, it's a bit risky. Like I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but I still have a moment where I go, oh, is this okay? No, it's fine. Like I'm not sinning, it's fine. Uh, I don't and I don't understand how garments have changed to allow more revealing clothes. Like that's no one was going to leave the church because they couldn't show the shoulders. Like if you truly believe it, it's not going to break your world. Um, and I don't think. I mean, I'm happy to be wrong, but I wouldn't imagine the kind of God that would exist in my brain from the perspective of what I understand about the church. I don't think he'd change his mind about whether your shoulders are modest or not, just because we live in 2025 now. That doesn't make sense to me at all.
Yeah, can we park that question
Sorry,
for now? Um,
it blew my
I
mind.
I'm not going to claim a pool of knowledge on the intricacies of garments for women. Okay, I think would be fair to say.
No,
Um,
yeah,
but no, I hear where you're coming from. All right, and that things do change, and the church does change, and what the church does is it just changes things, and it doesn't, and it very quickly. Again, my opinion, is it's really, really good at just changing the narrative and the way we talk and the language that's used, and the organization follows with it, you know. Um
Yeah.
just follows with it and accepts those things. And sometimes you look at it and think people will literally think that will literally swear that that's the way we've always done it because we follow what the brethren tell us because that's who they are. They speak for God.
Yeah, I mean, and that's to do with like, am I right here? Ongoing revelation, because that's like a key part
Yeah,
of it. Is they can, give us updated information,
yeah,
but
absolutely.
either there's an admittance that someone was wrong, and that's not exactly 100% true. And if someone was like, oh, that was a mistake, um, maybe someone's personal feelings got in the way of doing divine revelation or whatever, fine. Like, maybe I don't know if a member of the church, an active member of the church, would feel the same way, but I could accept the fact that someone might get corrupt along the line. I don't know that I can accept that God's just changed his mind. I find it a lot more easy to accept that a man was like corrupt and just put his personal opinion in there than God changed his mind.
Yeah,
I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm not saying that's what happened at all. I don't understand how it changes.
it's an interesting one. I don't think the church tends to just move forwards with things. They don't normally issue an apology along an apology or admit fault as such. They just will talk about what's happening next
But
and
why?
move forwards. That's a really good question. That's a
That's
really
what I
good
mean.
question.
I don't
All right.
understand why. I think it adds more credit. I do. And again, I really don't want to speak out of turn. And I'm happy to be so wrong in my train of thinking. I just don't understand.
I can give you an opinion on this, but I don't. But whether I'm accurate or not is another matter. Okay. Um, I think the problem comes because a prophet speaks for God, and when he has a revelation, he says that something is to be so. As I said, if a prophet speaks, the debate is over. He speaks for God. So if the prophet says one thing today
Hmm.
is X, and then the prophet in 20 years' time says
Hmm.
Y, and Y contradicts X,
Hmm.
yeah, then that in itself calls into question what the first prophet has said.
Yeah.
Yeah, and therefore it calls into doubt his prophetic mantle, his role as a prophet. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, if he was a prophet and he said such and such as a prophet, and he speaks for God and the debate is over, then that has to be true. But what you're saying today contradicts that.
Yeah.
So who was wrong?
Yeah.
Yeah. So who was wrong? Do you speak for God or do they speak for God? The moment you can see that the previous prophet doesn't speak for God or
Hmm.
didn't in this instance, it then turns around and says, "Well, how can I trust that what you're saying is what God now wants me to know?"
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you turn around and admit someone was in the wrong, you are taking away. If you discredit an earlier prophet's prophetic mantle,
Hmm.
yeah, you are implicitly turning around and saying, and therefore we can't trust what you're saying to me either.
I mean, yeah, okay, I guess I can see
All
that
right,
point too.
and that's like I said, I'm not an expert. That's how I look at it.
Hmm.
You know, I'm sure there's many more intelligent people than me can give a better explanation than that, and I'm
Mm.
sure that within the church they would give a different accounting for what I'm saying. But that's how it feels to me.
Okay.
Yeah, is that by discrediting what a previous prophet has said as a prophet, it discredits the whole idea of being a prophet. And then why would people do what I want, follow what I'm saying now? And so the church will talk about what's happening next, but they will skirt on past what's happened in the past. All right. They will gloss over and play down things that are difficult, awkward, controversial. Yeah. So, for instance, we got going back. It's not because I want to really drill into the rock and hat. I really don't. It's just it's a good example
Okay.
to work with. The narrative of how the Book of Mormon translated has been the same for generations.
Oh,
The rock in the rock the church owns. If you go to the church's vaults,
I want to
it's
see that
there.
one.
You can find a box with it there, but they wouldn't have admitted it was for quite a long time, and then suddenly they admitted it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. First vision. There's multiple accounts of the first vision when Joseph saw the official version is Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ. There was a version that was written in Joseph's own handwriting in 1832, which is a little bit different and contradicts the later versions, the official version. Joseph F. Smith, who was one of the previous prophets, found it in the diary, ripped it out the diary, and locked it away in a vault. And
Oh,
it
for real?
only later, when people realised there was something missing and it existed, did he eventually have to go and find it and put it back. Yeah.
Oh,
Okay. These are examples of that I can give you of where the church has controlled the
wait, how
narrative.
was it? Was it massively?
And we do that as a whole entire episode.
Okay,
It's an
sorry.
interesting conversation. No, it's all right. It's all right. Or we can do a like 20-hour episode. It's not a problem. I don't mind. Yeah. But again, the first vision itself and understanding the first vision is a really interesting conversation in its own
Hmm,
right. Something I find fascinating.
okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's crazy. I didn't know that. Sorry, I'm taking a moment to digest that. I don't
Oh
know.
yeah.
See, again, I would thought it added more legitimacy to it to keep it in there because apart from anything else, we know that memories change. That's
Yeah.
part of how memory works. If he's written it
Yeah.
down two different ways, yeah, that's normal. When you recount something lots of times, it does change. That's how memory works.
Yeah. But to be fair to him, the guy's only human. All right,
Yeah.
with 2020 hindsight and those kind of things, maybe it would be better to have kept it in if he knew that in by 2025, multiple versions of this are going to come available. The internet is going to be there. People will be pouring over and examining these kind of things. If
Yeah.
you know that's going to be the case, absolutely. In sort of 1920s, 1930s, or wherever it was where he did this, I can just. I don't know, I wasn't there, but I can imagine looking, going, flipping it. That's a little bit awkward. We don't need that, and it's done. The
Let's go
deed
with
is
that one.
done.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It quite possibly was nothing more than you know, and it is what it is. Uh,
Crazy. Okay, sorry.
what are your
I'm digesting
thoughts?
now.
What are you thinking? What are you thinking?
I don't know. I mean, I just think it's answered some questions. It's definitely added more questions. But I think this
Okay.
happens every time we talk, like every time we talk about this kind of thing, it always adds more questions to the list. And it just
Yeah.
further makes me understand.
So, what questions do you think I've answered, and what questions have I given you?
Okay, so you answered questions. I'm really appreciating the shelf analogy actually. Um,
Yep.
that was something that I've always really struggled to understand is how you can square it away so that things can be like true and not true in your brain at the same time. Um, so that's really helpful to understand, at least from your perspective anyway, that you pop it on the shelf and then you just can't deal with it right now. I'll come back to it later, potentially. That's really helpful. I It's really interesting to see how the narrative of you. Oh my words, they're all coming funny. Of how being told like by people that you trust your whole life builds that belief in you. Because I completely understand that. I had that. Sometimes I still have like a little voice in the back of my head that goes, "Ooh," I completely understand that. Um, and I understand because they say not to question it, you just don't. I guess I get that too, to a degree. I don't know that I could have not questioned it because I question everything, but I think that's just because I'm really nosy. And I don't know at what point you go, I don't know at what point it would break because I think that that's kind of how people have started, because there's been a lot of people starting to move away in more recent years, hasn't there?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that there is more people, but it's because there's more information available as well. When I was even the age that you are now, there was limited information available. I actually had access to more information than most, because of your mum's dad, yeah, who
Yeah.
um, read lots of interesting books, and and that's the other side of it as well, actually, which I've not talked about is the idea of inoculation, I guess, is when
Yeah.
you become exposed enough to well, inoculation vaccination is the idea you give someone a dummy shot
Yeah.
of something that will make them ill, and it would and they builds up a resistance to it.
Yeah.
Okay, um, because of your granddad, and
Mhm.
because he was a questioner, and he was someone I respected, whose
Oh
opinion
yeah,
I
sure.
respected, and I got on very well with him. All right.
Mhm.
And he looked at a lot of these issues, squared the circle,
Mhm.
and used them to be able to, and was able to therefore perhaps use them to build his faith rather than tear it down.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
I
All
the
right.
interesting thing about Grandad for me was that as much as I fundamentally disagreed with what he believed,
Yeah.
I admired how much time and effort he put into like researching and nurturing his own beliefs and
Mm.
like becoming completely like he wasn't questioning anymore because he had an answer. And
Yeah.
whether I agreed with his answer or not, he understood for himself. And that whether or not I agree with somebody's belief system, I can respect the fact that if you feel like
Yeah.
you've got the answers, like I'm totally fine with that. I don't.
Yeah.
The beauty of the world is that we've all got different opinions on things.
Yeah.
We don't
Um,
have to believe the same things, but I'm really impressed when you can come with a complete answer on why you think that way. Does that make sense?
yeah. No. No. I agree. But because of your granddad, there to an extent, I was able to. I was able to, what's the word I'm looking for? He gave me enough information about some of the more controversial issues that existed in the church before um, I was for before they became on the internet and stuff like that. So when a lot of these things came out at a peripheral level, I was able to see to just nod and say, "Yeah, I've heard of that. I know about that. I know about that." In a way that some people would have been like, "That's new to me."
Yeah.
I've just realised that we have had some people commenting in the stream in the last bit a little bit.
Oh, I can't see.
We Mary has commented. We've mentioned the Rock and the Hat a few times. Mary's turned around and said the truth was revealed on South Park before the church admitted the stone in the hat. I mentioned that earlier. Thanks for that for that, Mary. Absolutely true. Absolutely true. I think it's fascinating that South Park got that right. The other one, I didn't realise this to be the case. And she's also said that men are getting a sleeveless garment as well. Um, I don't wear garments anymore, but I can tell you that I would have appreciated a sleeveless garment as well. So brilliant, and we've got those thoughts coming through. Um, there's lots with the church, and I think that we've got. I'm hoping we've got the start of today of some really interesting conversations that we can explore over time.
Mhm.
Um, why don't people question it? I think it's actually a really, really tough question. And guys, if you're in the stream, chime in. If you're reading here, why don't people question for so long? I think everyone has their own reason. Okay, I think it comes back to a mixture of that testimony, that spiritual witness overriding everything else. I think it comes back to a mixture of trusting the things that you've been taught, particularly for someone who's grown up in the church, for instance, that you have that utter trust in the people that taught you, that they
Yeah.
wouldn't that they wouldn't lie to you and they wouldn't lead you wrong. Um, and I think it's a mixture of the church's stance in not looking at unapproved sources of information. Um, the idea, and my mum always would say, if you want to know about the church, ask a member of the church because no one's going to know better than them. And meant sincerely is if you
Mhm.
want to know what the church believes, ask the church because it's their church and they're not, and the church wouldn't lie to you, of course, and therefore it's going to be the best source of information, and therefore we don't need to go elsewhere. And I think that attitude pervades with the quotes that I gave overlaying that. And
Mhm.
I'm going to praise that with a I think.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Because every person will have their own version of the story. There may be similar themes to what I've mentioned, but everyone's take is going to be slightly different.
Mhm.
What is interesting is what happens when someone does step back, look, and question and examine some of what I'll normally refer to as the truth claims of the church, and find things are not as they expected. Um, and that was my experience when I started really questioning where I'm at, and I looked at the things that I'd always been taught and looked at the um, evidences that are out there. For me, I had posted on Facebook earlier today in one in there's a UK um, ex-members community that I'm part of, and I posted in there about a resource called Mormon Discussions. It's part of the Mormon Stories podcast. If you're listening or watching this, the Mormon Discussions series, it's 60 or 70 episodes long. It's long. It's a lot of watching. But it's worth watching sequentially. It was produced initially by Mormon Stories, and they work with a guy called Mike. I don't know his last name because he never shared his last name. And he produced a series of episodes that look at all the different aspects of this very carefully, very well researched, very well evidenced, and allow you to see how those truth claims stack up with each other. For me, was a very powerful resource, and I would recommend it to others if you are looking to understand these things better. We've been going for an hour and 23 minutes, Louisa. Are you exhausted yet? Have I worn you out?
Not worn out, just ready for bed though.
When we started, you said you were nervous.
Yeah.
Have you enjoyed being on the podcast with me today?
I
You
have.
can say
It's been
no.
interesting. No, I have. It's been interesting. I feel like there was a lot of information I took there. I've got questions teeming out of my brain that I'm trying to sort into an order, and I'm desperately hoping that I haven't offended anyone.
I'm sure you haven't. I'm sure you haven't. Well, I suggest that we reconvene next week at the same time,
Sounds like a
and you
plan.
let me know what question you want to dig into next. You don't need
Okay.
to let me know, but I do need to know before next week.
Yeah, no, that's fine. It's a fun idea right now.
Yeah. If you are still with us on this live stream, okay, Louisa, what I'd like you to do is take your fingers and point downwards like that.
Down
Because
here.
just down there where Louisa was pointing, you're going to find a button that says like. I really would appreciate it if you find that like button and smash it. Okay, because that tells the YouTube algorithms that people like what we're doing. If you go along a little bit, there's another button called subscribe. If you hit that subscribe button, it'll let you know when we're doing this next week as well, so you can come back and join us again. And again, the algorithms like it when we have lots of subscribers. So if you are with us this long, I really would get on my knees and beg you to like and subscribe. In the meantime, I think that it's time to wrap it up there. Louisa, have you got any thoughts, anything you'd like to share before we finish today?
Uh, I just, I think that if you're questioning, it's okay. I don't know if anyone else has told you that, but I think asking questions is good.
Fantastic. And I totally agree. I totally agree. The goal here is not to tell you what you should believe, what your position and stance with the church should be. Um, I want to answer your questions, Louisa. I want to help you understand this strange, crazy, good, bad faith that has been a backdrop to your life. And I want to help other people who've got questions being able to get their head around those questions as well. If you like what we've done, like I said, please like and subscribe. If you've got questions or you want things that you want us to examine, drop us a message in the chat. Get in contact, and it'd be great to talk to you. In the meantime, um, my name's Beyond Belief, and I've been joined by Louisa tonight, and it's been an absolute pleasure being with you. And we will see you next week.